Hi guys and welcome. Today we will be painting this beautiful zebra eye in acrylics. I will upload the photo on my blog as well as the line art for anyone who's interested. And I will also post all the colors that I use just below in the description for this video. This video will be sped up, but you can slow the speed down if you look on the top right of the video. My sketch is already transferred onto a smooth gessoed panel, and using some burnt umber, I'm just going to start outlining some of the darker parts. Now bear in mind, my paintings are always extremely ugly until they get to the final stage. I work in many layers, and this little piece will be no different. I'm going to apply several layers, and I'm going to keep building up those layers and refining as I go along. At this stage, I'm really mostly concerned with just blocking everything in and just marking down where my darks will be and my lights will be. And then once that's down, then I can start building up my layers. So I'm just going to continue blocking in with my burnt umber. It's been years since I've worked with acrylics. I'm used to working mostly with oils now, and I much prefer the flow of oils. So for this reason, I am using a flow medium mixed into my acrylic paints. It just helps the paint spread a lot more easily onto the panel, and there's less drag with the paintbrush and the paint as I work. So thank God for flow medium. And I'm just going to continue blocking everything in. And I'm going to start blocking in the eye using some black. I was all out of black acrylic paint, so I just mixed my own black using cobalt blue, Payne's gray, and burnt umber. I find it's always best to mix your own blacks anyways. You can create a lot of different variations in depth and tone, and just have a richness that you don't get with black paints. And I'm just roughly marking in where my lashes are going to be. And I'm going to apply some black where the stripes are darker. And I'm just going to continue building up those layers. Just adding another layer to those stripes now that they're dried. When I apply paint to one section, I let it dry and then I jump around to another section. And then I can go back to the previous section after it's dry and just keep building up layers on top of those areas. And now I'm going to start blocking in the lighter colors. And for this section, I'm using a combination of Titan Buff with a little bit of Naples yellow as well as a tiny bit of raw umber just to gray out the color slightly so it's less of a bright yellow. And so I'm just going to continue applying this layer all over. And again, I'm not worried about detail here, how it looks. It's pretty crude looking. I'm just concerned about blocking everything in and getting one layer down. Just going to continue applying the paint, just making sure I've got the whole zebra covered before I continue with anything else. And now I'm going to start working on the background. In the reference photo, what you see is either the rear or the side of the zebra, but I decided that I wanted just a solid color. And I thought at this point that I wanted something more in the gold tones, a nice warm earthy tone. Later on, I decided to change it to a darker color. And I'm glad I did because I really love the contrast between the zebra and the dark background. And now I'm taking some raw umber and I'm just going to apply a light glaze over top, and I'm just loosely going in the direction that the fur is growing in. And again, not being too concerned about detail at this point. I just want to get a little bit of a darker glaze down so that I could start detailing after. The detailing will be lighter colored hairs, so it's important that the underpainting is just a little bit darker. This way we will be able to see the lighter colored hairs. If our initial base layer is too light, we're not going to have any definition in the fur or the hairs. And the only reason I started with the lighter color and then applied the glaze on top is because I wanted to get a specific tone. I didn't want to go in just straight away with the raw umber and have a darker color. I wanted the specific undercolor, so this is why I used a combination of a lighter color with a darker glaze over top. And now I'm just going to continue layering. Just build up those layers so that I have a nice opaque layer. I find acrylic paints are very transparent, so it takes a few layers just to get that nice opacity that I'm looking for. Section under the fur and some areas around the stripes, I mixed some burnt umber with just a little bit of burnt sienna just to get a little bit more of the reds into that brown. And you could see that top stripe, that top area where I was trying to apply paint, it was just lifting at that point. Just leave it alone, let it dry well before you return to it. Otherwise, you're just going to keep lifting paint. Now I'm starting to darken it up here, and I've got a mixture of burnt umber and raw sienna. And this will be, of course, darkened up a little bit later. You could leave it this color if you want, or use any color you want. It's all a matter of preference. And again, I'm going to add just another layer of glazing with the raw umber. I didn't feel it was dark enough yet, so I decided to just go ahead and add in that extra layer of glaze. And I'm going to start glazing a little bit of a darker color around the eye area as well. So I just want to build up that layer. And in case you're new to painting and you're not sure what a glaze is a transparent layer of paint that you're applying over the top of what you've already painted. You can still see what's underneath, but you're just adding that transparent layer of color. And again, I'm going to add another layer of paint. Just darken up those stripes, and I'm using brown mixed in with a little bit of cobalt blue. The paint is very transparent, so it does require a few layers just to get that right depth of richness and the right tone and that right opaqueness that I'm looking for. If I'd stop at just at a couple of layers, the paint would be too transparent and you just don't have that nice rich tone in your paint. So that's why it's nice to keep building up those layers. I find that a lot of people who paint with acrylics, especially when you're new to painting with acrylics, people don't put enough layers. They stop at a couple of layers and their paintings end up looking flat and lifeless. So just keep building up those layers. That's how you're going to get those rich tones. And I'm going to add another layer to the eye area. And here I'm using black paint. And I'm just going to keep building up those layers. And I'm just going to continue outlining the eye here just to start giving it a little bit more definition. And I'm going to extend that black mixture downward a little bit. And now I'm adding just a little bit of burnt umber, again, just working that layer. It's a little bit repetitive, but again, it's those layers that are going to make everything more realistic. So now here's where I'm starting to darken up my background layer. I'm using burnt umber as well as my black mixture on the outer edges. And I'm just going to keep building up those darker tones, adding more of the burnt umber and the brown mixture. And in some areas I did add a little bit of burnt sienna just to give it a little bit more of a reddish tint. And I'm going to keep darkening it with the black. And as you saw there, I used the hair dryer just to speed up the drying time so I can continue building up my layers. I did use also a little bit of burnt sienna into my burnt umber mixture just to make that brown a little bit more deeper and richer. So now here I took out a dagger brush and just started dabbing it down just to make tiny little hairs, and I'm using some tightened buff here mixed in with a little bit of raw umber. And I'm just gently tapping it down just to make little marks. And I'm just going to keep tapping it down. You can use any other small brush that you have, like a fine liner brush. And I'm just going to keep applying that. And this is where the tedious part begins. Unfortunately, painting animal hairs is a very tedious, repetitive process, especially when you're working with layers and continuously building up layers. You have to do a few layers to get depth and richness and a certain amount of realism in your work. So it's very repetitive. And this is where you develop patience and you have to just keep going and building up those layers. So this is just the beginning, and I'm just making tiny little marks. I've zoomed in a little bit closer so that you can see the tiny little brush strokes that I'm making. Again, I'm just very gently touching the surface. I've got very little paint on my brush. If I have too much paint, I'll just end up with big blobs on my canvas. And I also apply just very gentle pressure. If you put too much pressure, again, you're going to end up with blobs of paint on your surface. So use very little paint and reload frequently instead. And just use a very light, gentle pressure. And that applies for the rest of the hair that you're going to be painting throughout the painting. I'm also making sure that I follow the direction that the hair is growing in. So I'm constantly looking at my reference photo, and if the hair starts curving a certain direction, I make sure my strokes start curving that same direction as well. So pay very close attention to which way the hair or the fur is growing on your reference photo. And because this took a few hours to make, over 3 hours, and painting hairs is very repetitive, I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. So throughout the painting, while painting hairs, the main points to keep in mind are I am using a very gentle pressure, very little paint, following the direction of the hairs. If the hairs are long, I'm using longer strokes. If the hairs are shorter, I am using shorter strokes. And so now with my my Titan Buff paint mixed in with a little bit of white, I'm just going to start detailing and outlining the outside of the zebra. And I'm going to keep applying paint and building up my layers. I've slowed the speed down a little bit now so that you could see how I'm applying the hairs on the brow. I'm using a mixture again of the Titan Buff mixed in with some white. And I'm just going to start again putting in those hairs in the direction that they're growing in. And I want to make sure that I overlap them and crisscross them. I don't want them going all the same direction and being all uniform. Otherwise, they're not going to look realistic at all. It's not going to look natural. So I make sure that nothing's perfect and everything is just overlapping and looking as natural as possible. Because I use very little paint on my brush, I frequently need to reload, so this adds to the painting time, but it's better than having too much paint on the brush and then just having messes on the canvas all the time. I'm using an angled brush here. It's just a cheap craft brush. It's not an expensive brush at all. And I just make sure that I keep it flat and pointy and I work with that flat edge. And this allows me to create fine lines. You can also use a liner brush. Actually, had I had a liner brush, I probably would have used a nice liner brush, but because I don't paint with acrylic much, I don't have as many brushes as I would like to have, so I may do with what I had. And that just goes to show you that you don't always need the perfect tools all the time. You can often just work with what you have and just make that work for you. And I'm going to speed this up again a little bit. Otherwise, we'll be here for 3 hours. You can see here how I'm able to make very fine lines just using the sharp tip of the brush. And now the real work begins where I have to do this all over the zebra. And I'm just going to keep going everywhere, all over until I've got a layer of hairs everywhere on the canvas. And I'm going to apply yet another layer. And I'm zooming in just a little bit closer on the brow area again, just so you can see the hairs that I'm applying. It's a little bit harder to see because it's a lighter colored area. And the reason it's lighter is because there's more light hitting in this area. So hopefully you could see the hairs. I will define them a little bit more later on, but at this point I'm just building up some hairs, and then where I'll need to later I will go in and apply a fine glaze. Over here I'm coming in with some raw umber and just applying a few little dark hairs just to try and give a little bit of definition, and this will make the lighter hairs stand out. Again, I'm using very light gentle pressure, just barely touching the surface. I'm adding a little bit of a glaze to the dark stripes just around the outer edges so that it looks like there's color underneath the white fur, but it's not a solid black color. It's a richer brown. So for this reason, I'm just using a little bit of burnt umber for this, just in select areas. I don't want my darker stripes to look like just solid black stripes. It wouldn't look natural that way. So by extending a little bit of lighter color on the outer edges of the stripes, they look a little bit more realistic. And now I'm going to start applying the same burnt umber glaze around the eye area. And this is going to help soften the whole eye rather than having very sharp black edges next to the light fur. We'd rather not have those sharp edges. We want to soften everything. And I'm just going to continue applying that glaze around the rest of the eye now. And I'm adding yet another layer of burnt umber mixed with burnt sienna in that little patch of color directly under the eye. And now I'm going to paint in little bits of light that are being reflected on the moist part of the eyelids. So I do this by mixing a little bit of cobalt blue. If you don't have cobalt blue, you can go ahead and use ultramarine blue. And I add just a little bit of burnt umber and white. That way it grays out my mixture a little bit and it's not that much of a bright blue. And I'm just going to keep detailing the eye and adding more layers. And just adding a little bit of that grayish blue mixture on the eyelids, the eyelashes. They're not really that defined yet. I'm just going to start adding little bits of color. Now there are also color variations inside the eye as well, so I'm going to add a little bit of that same grayish blue mixture just to outline the outside of the eye. And that's going to darken up a little bit as it dries. And here I'm adding a little bit more white to my mixture just to show a little bit more light being reflected. Just a little pop of light, just like that. And when you're painting eyes, you want to pay attention to anything being reflected in them and paint those in. These reflections are going to help to create a really realistic looking eye. And so for this reflection, I'm taking my gray mixture again, but I'm adding in a little bit more of the burnt umber. So this is just the first layer of that reflection, and we'll refine the eye again later. So now while I let that dry, I'm going to go back to my hair and I'm going to start adding some hairs on this section of the zebra. And again, using my Titan Buff mixed in with some white. And I'm still using that same brush and I'm just, again, following the direction of the hair. And on this section under the eye, the hairs are a lot shorter, so my strokes are going to be a lot shorter as well. So I'm just, again, barely touching the surface and just adding tiny little marks, just barely hitting the board with the paintbrush. And again, very little paint. And because this is such a tedious, repetitive process, I'm just going to speed this up just a little bit. My brush strokes are just a little bit longer on this part of the cheek. And again, still using my mixture of white with Titan Buff. While my white paint is drying, I'm going to start defining some of my darker stripes now. And I've got my brown mixture. I've got some burnt umber, and I added just a little bit of raw sienna just to lighten it up a little bit. And I'm going to start defining some of the hairs in the darker sections. We don't want to ignore those. We don't want to have just plain black stripes. And I'm going to continue down on this section here, keeping it just a little bit lighter in this area. So I'm going to add a little bit of Naples yellow and a little bit more of the raw sienna just to keep it lighter in some sections. And here I'm going over this darker area. I'm just going to go back over top of this with a glaze after, just to correct the color. And now with cobalt blue, white, and just a hint of burnt umber, I'm going to just add just tiny little marks just to indicate some hairs. And they'll help to outline our zebra. And I'm going to continue down. And with my blue mixture, I'm going to start defining some reflections in the darker hairs. And I'm trying not to put too much of the blue, just a little bit here and there, and it's just going to indicate some light being reflected. And with the same blue mixture, I'm going to start detailing some of the lashes. Again, using very gentle pressure, trying to make just very fine lines. If my pressure is too heavy, I'm going to have thicker lines. So to keep the lines very fine, just barely touch the canvas or the surface you're working on. Normally, I would be using a very fine liner brush for this, a 00 or a 0 script liner brush. But as I said, I didn't have one, so I made do with what I had. If you're not comfortable working with a bigger brush like I am, be sure to use a fine liner brush. It'll be a lot easier. But this one flattened out nicely into a nice point, so it wasn't too bad. It was still quite easy to use this brush for fine lines. And I'm just going to keep refining the detail in the eye just until I'm satisfied. So don't be afraid to keep working on your painting. And now with some raw sienna, I'm just going to add some little fine lines directly under the eye just to start indicating some hairs. And I'm going to keep playing with this section and adjusting it and adjusting the color until I'm satisfied. I will go in again after with a glaze of burnt sienna and just darken up some of the sections. And now while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and apply another layer of hairs throughout the rest of the zebra. So I'm going to speed this up again just a little bit. And now I'm adding a glaze of burnt sienna just over top of that section. And the hairs are still showing through a little bit underneath. And now I'm going to add a little bit of pure white in certain sections and on top of the brow here as well. And this is going to add just a little bit more definition to those hairs. When I'm painting animals like this, I normally like to keep working and working until I've reached a level of realism that I'm happy with. So, like I said earlier, don't be afraid to keep working your painting. It's those layers that are going to give you depth and realism in your work. So, keep working it. I did end this short because it is a tutorial, but had it been my own work, I would just continue working this and just defining the details until I'm satisfied. So never be afraid to just keep working the hairs. And I'm going to add a little bit of black here, just starting to finish off some of those final details. And now I want to finish some of the details in this larger stripe, and I'm going to put in some of my raw sienna mixed in with some burnt umber. And then at the end, I'm going to add a little bit of the blue as well, just to add a little bit of shine in the stripe, some light being reflected in the hairs. And again, I'm just gently tapping my brush, just making very small strokes and with very gentle pressure. Heavy pressure is going to give me big blobs of paint, which I don't want. I'm using a very small brush for this. I believe this was a number 2. And I'm just again refining detail, adding another lighter layer of blue just to random hairs. And I'm just going to keep refining until I'm satisfied. And I'm going to refine the edges of the zebra with that same blue, just lightening it up just a little bit more, just to suggest detail. I don't want any solid lines, just little dabs of paint here and there. And just refining the detail on the lashes again with an even lighter blue, just a little bit. And on just this bottom part of the eye, I'm adding in a little bit of raw sienna mixed in with burnt umber. And I'm going to add a little bit in the reflection as well, just to have a little bit more gold inside the eye. And this is just final adjustments with some black. As part of some of the final details, I'm adding in some raw umber here, just random lines here and there, just to add a little bit more definition in the white hairs. Because it's so much white hair, it's sometimes hard to see some definition. So by adding just some random bits of some raw umber, I'm just creating a little bit more definition in between those white hairs. And once it's all done, it's just going to look so much better. And now I'm going to take a glaze using some Payne's Gray mixed in with just a little bit of burnt umber. And I'm just glazing around the brow, and it's just creating a softer shadowed area. And now I'm just going to go around the whole painting and just make some final adjustments, add some final highlights wherever I feel they're needed. And now for the very last detail on this painting, I'm going to add some very fine hairs underneath the eye. And I'm using a script liner brush. It's a 0 brush. And I load it with very little paint, and I make sure that I have some flow medium on there so that the brush flows on the canvas. And again, I'm just using very light pressure. If you use too much pressure, your line will be too thick. If you do end up with a very thick line or a line you're not happy with, just wipe it off and start over again. And I'm just keeping those lines very fine. And now we're done, and here's the final painting. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I'll be very happy to answer them if I can. And until next time, you guys take care.